Political tension and unrest in Bangladesh after the assassination of a student leader of last year's uprising that ousted Sheikh Hasina. Elections for a new government are due in February. So how volatile is the political situation now? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Dareen Abughaida. Hundreds of thousands of people have turned out in Bangladesh's capital Dhaka for the funeral of a student activist, Sharif Osman Hadi. Shot by an assassin who fled to India, he was a leader in the revolution last year that toppled Sheikh Hasina. Widespread human rights abuses, disappearances, torture, and killings became the signature of the 15-year rule of a woman once seen as a Democrat. Sharif Osman Hadi's killing underlines the current political tension in Bangladesh, where the interim government plans elections in February. At times in history, popular revolts don't always bring about the outcomes those behind them had hoped for. So what's the position now in Bangladesh, and how unstable and fragmented are its politics? Can elections bring real change and stability? And does the shadow of Sheikh Hasina and her supporters still loom large? We'll discuss all this and more with our guests shortly. But first, this report from Alexandra Byers.
Grief mixed with anger as huge crowds of mourners bid farewell to student activist Sharif Osman Hadi, shot by masked gunmen in Dhaka on December 12th. Hadi was a leading figure in the student uprising that helped topple Sheikh Hasina's government last year. For nearly a week, doctors tried to save him, but he died on Thursday. The government declared Saturday a national day of mourning.
Hadi was an inspiration and a key leader in our July uprising. You can see hundreds of thousands of people here today. Those of us who came cannot express our pain in words. Our hearts are bleeding.
His killing quickly triggered 2 days of protests and unrest. Many people speculate the killer may have fled to India, where former Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina is living in exile. She was found guilty of crimes against humanity and sentenced to death for ordering a deadly crackdown against the uprising in 2024. The UN says at least 1,400 protesters were killed and thousands injured.
We came today to attend the funeral, but for 9 days the authorities have failed to arrest those behind Hadi's killing. Hadi stood against Indian hegemony, and from now on, we are all Hadi. Those involved in the killing of Hadi must be brought to justice, even if they have fled abroad. We are also seeing provocations by former Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina while staying in India, and she should be extradited.
The unrest began in June 2024, when students organized mass protests against a long-standing quota system that reserved 30% of public service jobs for descendants of war veterans. They said it was unfair and favored the governing party. By mid-July, it had become a mass uprising against authoritarianism, economic woes, and rights abuses, and the government launched a brutal crackdown. But it failed, and in early August, Hasina resigned and fled the country. Bangladesh's interim leader, Nobel laureate Muhammad Yunus, has pledged justice after Hadi's death.
Hadi, tumi hariye jabe na.
Hadi, you will not be lost. No one will ever forget you. You will remain with us for generations. Your ideas will remind us to move forward like a brave hero.
Bangladesh is to hold elections and a national referendum on term limits for prime ministers in February, the first vote since the uprising. Yunus's administration is under mounting pressure over delayed reforms, and Sheikh Hasina's Awami League has been barred from running. Officials say nearly 130 million people will be able to cast their ballots, and there's widespread concerns this is a delicate time for Bangladesh, a chance for progress or for further instability and uncertainty. Alexandra Byers, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Okay, let's now bring in our guest. Joining us from Dhaka is Taqbir Huda, who's a human rights lawyer and Clarendon Scholar at Oxford University. Asif Shahan, Professor of Development Studies at the University of Dhaka, joining us from the Bangladeshi capital. Also there is Fahmida Khatun, the Executive Director of the Center for Policy Dialogue. That's a civil society think tank in Bangladesh. Welcome to you all. Thanks so much for your time. Asif Shahan, let me start with you. So Sharif Osman Hadi symbolized, many say, the youth uprising. His killing seems to have shaken the country. What's the mood like right now in the capital where you are? And does this signal a turning point?
Thank you, and thanks a lot for inviting me. Right now, the situation has kind of calmed a little, but it's still not sure whether this calm is just before a big storm. There were significant, vandalism that went on after the news of his death arrived. It was largely the government failed to contain the violence that erupted. But what happened is at the same time, there was an effort to sort of, some of the political actors, National Citizens Party and others, I think stepped in and tried to sort of, deal with the violence that was erupting. And that has created some impact. And at the same time, I think there was an understanding from Inkilab Moncho, the platform that Hadi was a part of, that this is actually going out of hand. So there was kind of an understanding and a statement from the political parties that let's not make Hadi's death, and which was essentially a reflection of July uprising, and he's considered a big hero, and the fight that he was doing for the democracy, for reform, for changing the societal structure, for cultural hegemony and others, the best way of honoring him is not to engage in violence, but to engage in dialogue and to deal with that. I think that particular is resonating. So we are seeing a little bit of calm right now.
Okay, Taqbir, Asif says that there's a little bit of calm, but at the end of the day, is this exposing just how fragile this transition is?
Yes, naturally. So it exposes that, in moments of revolution, it's far easier to unite against the common enemy, which was the autocratic Sheikh Hasina regime. But it's far more difficult once that regime is toppled to decide what vision for the future must look like. So, temporary allies against the Hasina regime have now turned into, political opponents for shaping Bangladesh's future. But I think less obviously, it also exposes a kind of social dissonance that I don't think got acknowledged as much during Sheikh Hasina's rule, which is a kind of disgruntled, a large chunk of the population who felt especially marginalized by Sheikh Hasina's rule, and that is the religious right and those from religious education backgrounds, and they form a large a large supporter base among Hadi's followers because they felt in many ways ostracized, stigmatized, otherified by the kind of war on terror language that the Sheikh Hasina regime co-opted and used to justify its, violent crackdown on religious-based groups in the name of fighting terrorism. So you must understand that Sheikh Hasina was an incredibly effective actor in the post-9/11 world and knew how to use those optics to her advantage.
Fahmida Khatun, you've said that the situation has gone from bad to worse. Law and order is volatile. The economy is stagnant. So 1 year after the uprising, is Bangladesh more unstable today than it was under Sheikh Hasina? How do you read the situation?
You see, it's difficult to compare because it is quite subjective. But if I had to compare, then I have to compare with the economy or political situation. So it was quite bad or it was worse. And if you compare the current situation, it's worse. And if it continues like this, it will get worse. So that's the situation. So during the last 15, 16 years, during the previous regime, the lack of democratic system had really led to an economic system which was not inclusive, which had a lot of deprivation. And despite the fact that the previous government claimed a lot of development and growth in the economy, we have seen also a lot of inequality and also lack of inclusiveness. And that's why the students were on the streets, because there were no investments, no job creation, and whatever jobs were available in the government sector was kept or kept for sections of the people under quota system. So the availability of jobs and employment or income had really squeezed. So that's why there was one type of deprivation, and now the situation is more of the law and order situation. So we see the police, local administration, political networks, all are experience some kind of shocks which have led to the insecurity of the people, and people are more unsafe and feeling the trauma of the breakdown of the system.
But Fahmida Khatun, let me ask you this. Let me just jump in there for a second.
The killing of Mr. Hadi.
Let me just ask you this question, though. So if public safety and jobs were the core demands of that revolution and the youth movement at the time, then has the new interim government failed at its first real test?
You see, we have not seen much improvement in the economy. Of course, there have been a number of reform initiatives, particularly in the financial sector, to be specific, in the banking sector. And as a result, we have seen a lot of measures which have been taken, and the central bank is trying to clean up the mess which has been created in the banking sector. And we have also seen some other sporadic reforms. And of course, the free fall which had started towards the end of the previous government, Awami League regime, when we have seen the macroeconomic stability had weakened. Now that free fall has been stopped. But having said that, the economy has not really bounced back. What we have, if we see the growth rate, that has been lower, the domestic resource mobilization, that is lower than the previous year, and the most important one is that youth employment generation, there has not been any employment generation. And because of the volatility of the situation, we have not also seen domestic or foreign direct investment in the country.
Asif, Shahan, look, many people say that Bangladesh's uprising echoes other popular revolutions, like we saw in Egypt in 2011 and we saw in Tunisia as well, where toppling the autocratic government at the time didn't guarantee democratic outcomes. What's the lesson that Bangladesh should be learning from these experiences?
Yes, that's a very important question. I mean, if you look into the 21st century revolutions, if we talk about Arab Spring, so these are different kind of revolutions. These are not necessarily ideology driven. It is not necessarily always run by the political parties. It's mostly about a kind of democratic reform, and it's mostly about there is no ideology per se, only the ideology of opposition, which means that a rejection of the earlier regime. That is what happened in Egypt, that is what happened in Tunisia, and this is what happened in the other Arab Spring countries, and exactly that happened in Bangladesh. But what we can learn from Egypt and Tunisia, if we compare these two countries, in case of Egypt, if you remember that there was significant disagreement between the political elites, both the right and the left of the political spectrum, could not come together, and which created an opportunity for the armed forces to jump in and sort of get away and destroy the possibility or potential of democratic transition. In contrast, Tunisia had a different story. In those cases, political elites actually could work together, and they managed to have an election. And at the same time, they also made substantial changes within their constitution. Now, what can Bangladesh learn from that? So there are just two points. One is the political elites, specifically the political parties which will participate in the election, they must remain committed, and they must understand that, election is the only way forward to make this thing. The second thing is the government needs to provide the adequate support that is necessary to make that transition. The government needs to start acting like a government, which is currently missing. So those are kind of the two things I think that is necessary to understand from the experiences of the Arab Springs, and that needs to be replicated in the context of Bangladesh.
Okay, Taqbir, is Bangladesh doing enough to prevent sort of the kind of counter-revolutions that we saw, for example, in Egypt? Does Bangladesh risk the same fate if its institutions aren't rebuilt quickly and there isn't unity among people?
I think what Bangladesh is currently facing after the revolution is, in fact, an identity crisis. Because you see, for too long, Bangladesh has defined itself in relational terms to its two nuclear-powered neighbors. So the Sheikh Hasina regime had really weaponized the term Rajakar, which is actually what triggered the revolution, which means war collaborator with the Pakistan army, right? So anyone who was seen as being anti-Hasina regime was tagged Rajakar, and that was enough to license all kinds of persecution. Right now, we're seeing something similar happening with anyone being termed RAW agent, RAW being the intelligence agency of the of India. So it's always defining itself in relational terms. Now, what this government and the next government really needs to do is be moved beyond this kind of politics of relational negativity and define in positive terms what it means to be Bangladeshi. And here is where we see clashes between the religious right and the secular left or liberals, because the burning of the cultural institutions, for instance, in the capital, was an act of violence by those who saw such culture as infiltration of Indian hegemony, right? But obviously, the secular left see these as integral part of Bengali identity and culture. And these frictions have been monumental since the creation of Bangladesh. And until this is resolved, and it can never be resolved if we oscillate between defining the other as a Rajakar or a Ra agent, but we must more define in more positive terms what it means to be Bangladeshi. And I think that is where that ideological vacuum or that vacuum of identity really needs to be spearheaded by whoever leads next. And sadly, the interim government has sort of, not been able to define that in clear enough terms. Even in its first, communication condemning the burning of Prothomalo and Daily Star, the newspapers, it did not mention the, burning or destruction of the cultural institutions. It's always, in retrospective terms. But the new government, whoever it might be, needs to really proactively define what it means to be Bangladeshi, moving beyond the question of loyalty to either India or Pakistan.
Okay, Fahmida, speaking of the next government, February's election is meant to be the end of a transition. But economically and politically speaking, can Bangladesh afford perhaps a delay of that vote or even a disputed vote?
Not really, because without a free and fair election and without a democratic government, the ambition for economic emancipation will not be fulfilled. Because at the end of the day, it is an democratically elected government which can determine the fate of the people, because we have to remember that Bangladesh is a young country. The average age of its population is 26, 27 years. And on the other hand, the majority, a large number of these youth are unemployed. About 20% of them are neither in employment, education, or training. So the government, any government who will be in power, has the responsibility to engage them in gainfully economic activities which can create income and a livelihood for them. So it is the responsibility of the government, an elected government, which has accountability, because an interim government does not have the mandate or the capability of providing economic benefits or whatever opportunities for the larger section of the people. And without any stable government, the investors will not come, because investors invest for a longer period of time. They want to see their return, and and the industries will not be able to cope with the the disasters or the political disasters,
Right.
and the private sector will not be able to cope with the increased cost of doing business. So all
Okay.
these are going to create a lot of problems, and that's why a politically elected democratic government will be able to address this situation in a better way.
Asif, Shahan, you've said that the uprising wasn't just about removing Sheikh Hasina, but about preventing another authoritarian system. Do you believe that that authoritarian system has truly been dismantled? And if those power structures haven't changed, then was this really a revolution? Or was it just kind of a changing of the guards?
I mean, to be very honest with you, as I was mentioning earlier, the 21st century revolutions are kind of a different thing. It's more about reform focus. It's more about changing the political structure. So there have been some efforts. There were some efforts to sort of change the constitutional system. There are some compromises that have been made. There is a July Charter which sort of promises, the PM to have a term limit. There is a promise which will be, I hope, will be accepted through a referendum. There will be an upper chamber which will have some power to make sure that the constitution does not get amended arbitrarily. There is a promise of having some independent institutions. The question remains: what we observing right now, it's actually the agony of transition that all the countries that faces this revolution, they goes through that. It is possible that what we've seen in the last few days is kind of that the peak of the reign of terror, and probably things will stabilize. But at the same time, the question that you ask, that whether authoritarian is that the end of the authoritarian regime, it will depend on the next government. If we can
Okay.
have an election, and if we can have an elected government which are actually committed to make at least some of the changes and learn gradually and build the institutions slowly but surely, I think that will bring an end to the authoritarian system. If they decide not to do that or fail to do that, if the institutions are not necessarily being built, we will probably go back to square one.
Okay, Taqbir, how much faith rather, do you have in the upcoming elections?
I mean, look, if it goes freely and fairly, then this will be the first time anyone who's under the age of 18 will, or under the age of actually, 25, will be able to vote in a free and fair election. All they've ever seen is a Sheikh Hasina government. So, this is a huge moment for one of the largest democracies in the world. But at the same time, we can't ignore the fact that the Awami League has been banned and it won't be able to participate in the election. Historically, it has, roughly 40 to 50% of the voter share. So what do those voters do? Where do they go? Do they contest at all? Do they just seek to disrupt the electoral process through acts of violence? So these are some crucial questions that need to be sort of addressed head on. And we are already witnessing some acts of violence and disruption, which some suggest are being coordinated by Awami League leaders who are in hiding or in refuge in India. So a lot really depends on how securely and safely the elections are able to sort of go ahead. But I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that this is the first time in Bangladesh's history that potentially Bangladesh, the only choice between Bangladesh isn't between the duopoly, or the dynastic duopoly that usually dominates elections, which is the Awami League and BNP. New players are emerging, and they have more significance than ever before. Of course, the Jamaat party has, in pre-opinion polls, for whatever they're worth, are showing a huge, growth in its sort of influence compared to its historic voter share. And then, of course, there's the National Citizens Party, which was formed in the wake of the revolution by the student leaders. It's hugely significant, and
So, Taqbir, now that you have these movements,
what that means for Bangladesh.
Hang on a second. So now that you have these parties rather emerging from the student movements, does that tell you that Bangladesh is heading towards pluralism or perhaps fragmentation?
It's actually signaling both, because obviously the fact that the duopoly has ended is a positive step. But at the same time, opinion polls show that BNP still dominates. And historically, no major party has had to share a large chunk of the constituent, seats with any other party. Jamaat has historically been the ally for Awami League and BNP, but it's been a small partner. This time, it's looking to be, a much larger partner if these opinions are true. So a lot depends on how much BNP and Jamaat could potentially cooperate with one another. Historically, they have been allies. Now they're opponents who might, share the parliament. So a lot hinges on that.
Let me just bring in Fahmida for this. We're running out of time, but in about a minute or so, if Bangladesh fails to deliver on jobs, security, credible elections, the issues that are important to people, does this revolution then risk producing the opposite of people want?
Actually, yeah. So though political, economy is very important for every country, and that's why even if we have a democracy without economic progress, there will be frustrations, and the frustrations are already among the young people who have been deprived of any employment opportunity. And ironically, in Bangladesh, the more educated a person is, the unemployment rate is higher. That is, a university graduate finds it very difficult and challenging to find a job. So
let me just jump in there because we've run out of time, and I'd like to give the final word to Asif Shahan. My apologies. But Asif Shahan, final word to you. How optimistic are you about the future of Bangladesh?
Well, I would say it all depends. I mean, a lot depends on whether right now Bangladesh is facing a dilemma. At one end, we don't necessarily have any other option other than having an election. But at the same time, there's a concern whether the current government really have the capacity to hold that election in that particular way. So if we can have an election and there is a transition and there are some changes that I was talking about, as part of the July Charter, some significant changes, then yes, things will slowly change. But, again, if the election is not necessarily, is a peaceful one, if it's a violent one, and essentially it creates a huge problem, and if the next government doesn't necessarily do anything to change the structure, which is I think the main focus of this revolution, then I don't necessarily think any change to take place. So those kind of those factors where things will eventually, depend.
We'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much to all my guests, Taqbir Huda, Asif Shahan, and Fahmida Khatun. Thanks so much for joining us from Bangladesh. And thank you for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, you can go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Join the conversation on X as well. Our handle is AJ Inside Story. From myself and the whole team here in Doha. Thanks for watching, and bye-bye for now.